Good afternoon. My name is Bob Boyers. It's my pleasure to welcome you to a panel on individualism and moral values. This panel will no doubt tackle a number of issues not strictly cited in the prompts that we've received from our conference organizers, but we are, I think, certain to consider versions of the following questions. 1, why are liberals often, not always, reluctant to speak about morals and to invoke communal values? 2, what is the relationship between individual rights and duties to the public good? 3, what are the moral values that liberals hope to cultivate? And what are the dangers that come with an insistent emphasis on moral issues and moral education in a liberal democracy? Our speakers, whose credentials appear in your program, are Patrick Deenen, William Galston, Lynn and Helena Rosenblatt. For those of you who haven't been here at previous sessions, each of our speakers will hold forth for about 5 minutes, after which they will engage with one another and then respond to questions from the audience. Helena Rosenblatt will start us off.
Thank you. So it's remarkable how often we use the word liberalism and how hard it is to define. People often start their work when they're writing books or articles or essays saying, you know, liberalism is a very slippery concept. It's vague. It's hard to define. And they have, you know, then they kind of put together their own personal definition. But one thing that they almost always agree on is that it's about individual rights. Defenders and critics of liberalism all say that it essentially has to do with individual rights. Even Larry Siedentop's recent book that argues somewhat implausibly, I think, that liberalism owes its origins to Christianity, says that it's because Christianity invented the individual. When most scholars today trace the genealogy of liberalism, they can begin and include different thinkers. They can begin with John Locke, for example, move on to Smith and John Stuart Mill and so on. But they invariably read these thinkers as stressing individual rights. And I would say that they mostly brush aside those aspects that don't fit this interpretation of the early liberal thinkers. They relegate virtue and public spiritedness to a kind of secondary role. Many of my students, when I teach a course on the liberal tradition, seem to think that that's a big lie, that when the liberal thinkers speak about virtue and about generosity and about the public good, it's a mask. They're hypocrites. They're really all about self-interest. It's a big fake. What does this sort of cynicism do to our culture is a question, you know, that I'd like to pose today. And is it anyway accurate? If you look at what liberals were trying to do in the context of their times, what they felt that they were doing, the battles they were engaged in, and you look at this in the context of their time, you'll see that a definition of liberalism that places such emphasis on individual rights and interests is actually a misrepresentation and distortion of the truth. My own research tells me that early liberals were moralists at heart. They never spoke about, or hardly ever spoke about, rights without speaking of duties. In fact, they often said that we have rights because we have duties. Like so many other isms, individualism was a pejorative term in the 19th century. And most liberals throughout that period avoided the term. Tocqueville described it as a modern form of selfishness. Constant and others spoke of individuality instead, a term that suggested the possibility of character building, of connectedness with others, of basically moral comportment, that human beings were capable of being generous and good to one another. while they develop their own personalities and their own characters. I certainly don't want to suggest that liberals lived up to their principles or that they weren't seriously flawed. Obviously not. My students are right to point to passages in these thinkers which are sexist, racist, imperialist. But I would say that these things are not what is liberal about the liberal tradition. They're not what distinguishes liberals from others at the time. We need to look at them in historical context. And I do want to get back to their concern with morals, how much they spoke about it and how much they thought about ways to cultivate it, how they couched their principles in moral terms, because that's how they saw their principles. It's strange that this central part of the history of liberalism, its sense of moral purpose, has been somehow lost. And liberals today, I think, are not very good at using the language of morals, of patriotism, of the common good. They seem to have conceded the high ground to their adversaries. I'm speaking of ways of speaking, ways of defining oneself, ways of conveying one's message to the public. One of our speakers today writes about our flattened cultural lexicon, a forgetfulness about a world in which individuals took seriously not only their own personal aspirations, but also the obligations that bound them to other people. And I regret that. I think that's it.
Oh, okay. Patrick Deenen.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I'm told that I'm to add some flavor to the proceedings as a critic of liberalism. And as a critic of liberalism, I thought I'd at least begin by pointing out that I'll be on a panel next week at my institution, the University of Notre Dame, in which two of my critics and strong defenders of liberalism will be laying into me, probably for a very long period of time, allowing me some words. One of them is Charles Kessler at the Claremont Institute, perhaps best known today as a Trumpist supporter. The other will be Jonah Goldberg, who writes for National Review, and who's written a book called The Twilight of the West, I think, or Suicide of the West. Both of them will criticize me for my critique of liberalism, and it's worth it, I think, in a set of sessions that we've had thus far that has largely, I think, given us the impression that liberalism is largely something possessed or owned by the left, that the right, that's often being critiqued here today, very much embraces, or many on the right very much embrace the label of being liberals. And in many ways, what's contested is what exactly is liberalism, what do we mean by liberalism? I guess I would say that, and I would agree with Helena and I would agree with Edward Luce, that maybe the one thing that holds these two faces of liberalism, if I could talk about them in those terms, that holds them together is a shared belief in the freedom of the self, particularly, I think, as Mr. Luce said this morning, the freedom of the individual from unchosen ties and bonds. You talked about a kind of anonymity or the ability to shape oneself from a condition of a kind of anonymity or a separation from those forces that seek to shape us. That is to say, one of its core features is individualism or individuality. But there's deep contestation over what's the best way in some ways in which this is expressed or achieved. In the classical liberal tradition, that form of individual selfhood was largely conceived in economic terms. And we think of figures like John Locke or James Madison. James Madison, in his famous Federalist 10, writes that the first object of government is the protection of the diversity of faculties of men from which the rights of property arise. So the rights of property are vested in the diversity of the faculties of men, the protection of which is the first object of government. This emphasis on property rights, of course, one sees also in John Locke, his predecessors. And the classical liberal tradition, and I think its inheritors or its disciples, who now are called conservatives, have sought to overcome limitations to economic individualism, whether it's limitations imposed by the state, or by religion and moral considerations, or by geographic limitations. most of course, seen today in the effort to expand our economic order beyond national boundaries to the globe. But these same thinkers, and here I want to agree with Helena, these same thinkers stressed the central importance of moral formation and of the virtues. But they saw these largely as the realm of what you call sort of civic associations or private entities or groupings, family and religion and associations and schools, that these were not the work or job of government per se, these were the work and job of those more private institutions that needed the protections, for example, of religious liberty, and why religious liberty was so central to a number of these thinkers, because it was the sphere in which the moral formation would take place. Now, very much in many ways, as a response to the success of this classic liberal project, certainly in the West, in the United States and England, and because of the rise of a kind of economic individualist in the 19th century, you had a kind of second wave of liberalism, what we think of today as progressive liberalism, what's been in many ways on display today. One of its primary thinkers is John Dewey, who decry the individualism, especially that economic individualism that leads to deep and profound economic inequality. And the call for the state now to step in order to articulate and to defend a conception of and a realization of a common good, particularly in economic terms. But note that this is also done in the name of individualism. John Dewey writes a book called Individualism, Old and New, and argues that the old individualism is a frontier individualism. And the new individualism will be the individualism that will be allowed to us when each of us has, in some ways, a kind of equal opportunity, particularly through equalization of economic opportunity, to pursue our own ends as we see fit. This form of liberalism, in some ways you could say, embraces a kind of moral, this kind of liberalism embraces a kind of moral individualism, the freedom to live as one wants, and that the state is now a kind of an aid to this pursuit. So whereas the sort of older model argues for an open economic realm and a more constrained social realm, progressive liberalism in some ways argues for a more constrained economic sphere, but a much more open social sphere. And therefore, ironically and interestingly, progressive liberalism, one of its key features comes to be critical of those institutions, those authoritative institutions that were once seen as necessary as inculcating the virtues, as inculcating a certain kind of character, as the authoritative institutions of civil society, now as undue restraints upon our liberty, family, religion, and so forth. And seeks to do, it seems to me, one of two things: either to minimize the control of these institutions over the lives of individuals, increasingly replacing them with state-mandated structures, for example, public education being one of those, or in some ways you could say comes to take them over, make them a kind of aid to the vision of progressive liberalism. And this has been in some ways one of the great successes, it seems to me, of the political left. I know many on the left feel today that they've lost everything, but for those on the right, they think they've lost everything because they've lost all of the cultural institutions, the universities, the schools, the churches, and so forth. Now, it's these two faces of liberalism that have been contesting and in a pitched political battle for at least the last 50 years, what we think of as conservatism and liberalism. And yet, as I argue in my book, both individualisms have advanced. Each side has been successful in advancing its vision of individualism. So even as both sides feels as if they're losing their part, their territory, the state on the part of the left, the cultural institutions on the part of the right, both in some ways have been successful in advancing both economic, what's called neoliberalism today, as well as moral or lifestyle liberalism. And so the left rightly feels we've lost everything. The neoliberals have taken over everything. And the right rightly feels, I think, we've lost everything. We used to have the universities and the churches and the various civil institutions, and they're gone. Indeed, it's actually more ironic than that. If one thinks about it, the authoritative institutions of moral formation now are largely controlled by the left. Universities being a good example. Whereas increasingly, and I think in many ways in response to this, the political institutions have been extensively captured by conservatives. Again, if you think of the American electoral situation, for example. And yet both sides believe that they are losing. Not only then is this kind of advancing individualism, I think, on the left today given rise to a crisis of liberalism, particularly in the way in which liberalism is now seen as a constraint to an advance of democratic socialism, but I think it also helps to explain the rise of populism that otherwise seems so inexplicable. Now, for all of its inchoateness, and I know Michael Kazin here, who's much more of an expert on this, it seems to me that in certain respects, that what we think of as populism is a very inchoate and very inarticulate rejection of both individualisms. It needs to be guided, it needs to be tutored, it needs a leadership class that understands it and doesn't simply condemn it, but that in many ways it's simultaneously rejection of economic liberalism, arguing for the need for a national as opposed to a global form of economic order in which the working class and all classes of society in some ways are considered. It consists in a mistrust of economic elites and of mobile capital, but it's also a rejection of moral liberalism, of this form of individualism, and thus gain the support of religious conservatives and, among other things, the promise of control of the Supreme Court, and we see where this has gone.
Patrick?
This is also a mistrust of cultural elites in the universities and media and so forth. So having said all this, let me just highlight something I might want to say in our discussion, which is I think that precisely because in some ways both the left and the right have abandoned or lost the language of the common good, it's not a very promising political movement, but one nevertheless that I think we need to be attentive to. Thanks.
Thank you. Bill Galston.
Yes. Well, I'm going to remain seated, but I virtually rise in defense of liberal individualism, or at least a certain form of it. Unlike many critics over the past 150 years, and perhaps unlike someone who's now sitting on this panel, I do not believe that liberal individualism is a kind of acid that dissolves moral codes and morally formative institutions. I believe, on the contrary, that it requires, and to some extent, though not a sufficient extent, fosters a distinctive understanding of morality and of moral formation. And let me just spend a couple of minutes spelling this out with respect to two, what I believe are core liberal principles. Number one, the idea of consent as the basis of legitimate political authority and, to a considerable extent, of desirable social relations as well. If you reject the idea of legitimacy through divine anointment, if you reject the idea of legitimacy through the parental model, so that the king or the ruler is the parent, almost always the father, and the citizens are the children guided by the parent. If you reject both of those models, then legitimacy through the consent of the government emerges as a very, very plausible, plausible counter account. I don't think it's any accident that it has carried the day. George Washington may have been the father of his country, but he couldn't get to be president unless and until the American people consented to that elevation. And in society, liberal individualism suggests that no one else has the right to choose your mate, your profession, your associations, or your way of life, or your religion. Like Ed Luce, I think that's not only definitive of liberalism, but definitive of some of the basic building blocks of a good life. I'd also point out that consent is not typically purely, narrowly, hermetically sealed individualism. It's usually dyadic or two-way. It's a process of mutual acceptance. A party makes a marriage proposal, but there's no marriage unless that proposal is accepted, no matter who makes it. I think that one of the quintessential liberal acts is the naturalization ceremony. where newcomers agree to accept the rights and responsibilities of citizenship in their new country, and the people I will call incumbent citizens agree to accept their offer to do so. I have often thought that one could construct an account of liberalism out of the book of Ruth. You know, on the one hand, Ruth, your people will be my people and your God will be my God. On the other hand, it wasn't until that offer was accepted that this coming together was consummated and the grandmother of King David became a Jew. I'd argue further that choice is not blind or morally rudderless. There is a morality of choice and consent that is not itself the product of choice. Every liberal philosopher who's serious acknowledges the presence of natural duties, not just natural rights, and the natural duties are imperative and social. They are not optional and individual. How much time do I have left?
Oh, at least 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay, the second liberal concept that I want to focus on as part of the morality, what I'm calling the morality of liberal individualism, is peaceful coexistence of difference. What I think was defined, this morning as toleration as opposed to tolerance. This is a major human accomplishment. It is not natural. It occurs within a shared framework of law. It's capacious regarding the differences that law does not seek to resolve or adjudicate through coercion. It implies something which I believe is definitive of liberalism. That is, the limitation, principled limitation on the scope of legitimate public authority. The adjective liberal in the phrase liberal democracy means limited democracy, a democracy that is not plenipotentiary, a democracy that leaves space, for what might be called a zone of indeterminacy, or otherwise put, a sphere of liberty. There is, of course, an ongoing debate within liberalism about the principles that constitute and delimit this zone. But that is, and the perimeter has shifted over time in response to changing conceptions and also changing circumstances. But that is what defines liberalism. Now, what I want to suggest, in conclusion, is that there are distinctive liberal virtues that are required in order to safeguard and perpetuate this zone of liberty. It requires enormous self-restraint. It requires openness to difference, which does not mean accepting it. And it means a process of mutual adjustment, much of which is informal, social, and at the level of norms rather than public laws. Every time I emerge from Penn Station onto the streets of New York City, I see little examples everywhere around me of this unguided process of mutual adjustment. It is a quintessential liberal virtue. Thank you.
Lynn Hunt.
Well, I'm going to, I think, echo some of the same themes that we have just heard, but I want to start by saying that I think one of the important things to keep in mind when thinking about these issues about liberalism is that liberalism historically was an oppositional position. And that, I think, is extremely important in the way that it is shaped and is also responsible for some of the current day problems when it's not as oppositional, if you will, as it was before. So in some ways you could say it's the kind of perennial problem of the left, which is always much better critiquing than it is governing. But liberalism is before that in a way, and I think this is really deeply important to understanding its character and its kind of protean character as well. That is, its kind of shapelessness, because it's much easier to say what you're against than to say what you're for. And I think that's actually one of the things that we're having a lot of trouble with right now, is it's much clearer to us what we're against than it is what we're for. Okay. I have slight difference in saying that, I guess I would say briefly, individualism, no. The individual person, yes. That is, in other words, I think what we're trying to find is a position that it's not the glorification of the individual as the foundation of an entire system of thinking, but I want to talk a little bit, and this is going backwards in time, I realize, about the fact that this notion of the individual that liberalism proceeds from is historically contingent. It's not actually a universal position, but it is a position which aims to be the foundation of a universal philosophy and politics. And that's a paradox, and I think it's also a dilemma. Okay, so to get the individual person, you have to, and this is echoing some of the same themes, you first have to get the separation of the individual from the webs of community, church, and even family. And this is itself a moral revolution. It is a revolution in what the foundation of morals is. In other words, not given, not tradition, not history, not the way it's always been, not what the family says, not what the church says, not what the state says, but something that the individual consents to. In other words, you have to get a vision of an individual as morally autonomous, capable of making decisions, and therefore capable of participating in politics. Now, in my own work, I've emphasized, someone brought up earlier that we didn't talk enough about media. In my own work, I've tried to talk about how novels, painting, and other media of the 18th century were part of this separation out of the individual. You actually had to be able to see individuals in new kinds of way, which meant naturalistic painting of individual faces, for example, and in the novel, portrayal of characters that you could see yourself as being like, even when they were of vastly different social standing than the people that you knew or were familiar with. These were cultural practices, I would argue, that contingently made it possible to theorize, to imagine the individual as the foundation of the moral and political order. Going even further, the individual, in a sense, had to become the locus of the sacred, whereas before the king had been the locus of the sacred. And this is an extremely important, many people have written about this, and I'm not going to go on about it. It has to do with Christianity, in the case of Christianity, giving up progressively, bit by bit, for some people all of a sudden, on the notion of original sin and the individual as a fallen example of the human race, and instead the individual as sacred, that is, as inviolable in some way. You don't get the abolition of torture. You don't get the abolition of brutal punishments. You don't get their unacceptability until you see the individual body as in some way inviolable by definition. So the sacred is very important in this. It's not that the sacred disappears. There's a kind of translation of it from within the political realm in a traditional hierarchical order, the king and the aristocracy as well, to the possibility of each individual. But at the same time, as Charles Mills told us this morning, so importantly reminded us this morning, this supposedly universal judgment was, of course, filled with all kinds of contingent applications. It didn't apply to women. It didn't apply to people of other races. It didn't apply to Native Americans. And this is where the difference problems becomes really important. How does that change? So there's the notion that the individual is sacred, but not just that the individual is sacred, but that the individual has capacities never before imagined. These include not just well, this would be positive rights as opposed to negative rights, the individual is capable of growth, of education, of learning, of becoming autonomous, of learning to participate in the political order. This notion of the capacities rather than the original sin of the individual, it seems to me, is extremely important. But this leaves still, and this is where I will end, the question of the relation between this new individual and the communities which, after all, he or she is, in fact, still part of. What is the correct relation between the individual and the family, between the individual and ethnicity, between the individual and the nation, between the individual and the state, more generally, between the individual and the social body? There is no individual without a social body, and it seems to me much of the debate within liberalism has to do with how to balance these two forces, the community and the individual. It's not that liberalism doesn't have moral values, it's that it sets up a new foundation for them, and this foundation, it turns out, is actually one that's very difficult for the contemporary world to live with. I'll stop there, because I know.
Do our speakers want to respond to one another?
There's so much to say.
there's-
Go ahead.
You want to start?
Well, there's so much to say, and it's all kind of twirling around in my head. And as I think I said before, I'm a historian, so I always feel a little bit anxious when I go into contemporary matters. But Bill, I don't think anybody could disagree with the way you describe liberal individualism.
That's good to hear.
Yeah, I mean, it all sounds very good. I guess I was talking about, I mean, it's true, they were for consent, the right to choose, and you spoke about the morality of actually marriage and gay marriage and what that means. But I would say that maybe it's about selling these ideas, that we today hear so much about individual rights. How about if you spoke about, this may sound a bit corny, I'm sorry, but like compassion, generosity, more than, peaceful coexistence and individual choice, but something about justice for all. I just keep hearing choice when they talk about the health care for everybody. They just keep talking about individual choice, that this is what it's all about, individual choice. Well, how about justice? How about what brings us all together as a country? And I think that language has fallen out of use. Am I wrong?
Well, I don't think you're wrong, but I want to add one word to what you've just said, and it's actually taken from something that Bill was saying a little while ago when he spoke of natural duties which are not optional. My question as I think about that expression is, what would make those duties seem natural, and how would we rationalize the thought that they are not optional? I have trouble, at least conceptually, thinking about that, even though in my own terms, I think I understand that completely. But I don't understand how I'd make that persuasive to someone who didn't see it exactly as I do.
Well, let me take a shot at it with an example.
Yeah.
You're born through no choice of your own. And I'm sorry, you're born, with no choice of your own. It's not a reflection of individual agency. Well, maybe somebody else's, but not yours. And you enter into a relationship that you did not choose. That choice, you don't have to believe in biblical revelation or the Ten Commandments. You don't have to believe that there is a biblical commandment to honor thy father and mother to be able to understand what flows from this unchosen relationship. It establishes a set of presumptions. Those presumptions are rebuttable in extreme circumstances. There are some circumstances in which the presumption to maintain a positive and respectful relationship with your parents is, that presumption is rebutted by extreme cruelty or abuse of a parent, such that your own sense of yourself is, can survive only when, in effect, you divorce that parent and dissolve that relationship. But that is the exceptional case. And in the general case, the usual case, there are certain duties, and as children, we all feel guilty when we fall short of honoring these duties, to give respect and affection to the people who gave birth to you and who raised you. I could pick other examples, but does that make my point more vivid? And
Can I just jump in on that? Because I think I know the phrase that got me, I don't know if it was the phrase that got others, was your phrase, which is very different from what you're talking about now, peaceful coexistence of difference. And the problem with that phrase was it made it sound a little bit like the community was in Cold War against itself. In the very notion of peaceful coexistence kind of implied armed powers who had decided not to kill each other, as opposed to compassion, a variety of sort of feelings about the common good that one wished we're going to just try to get along because otherwise we'll all die, but rather justice would seem to imply, the notion of social justice would seem to imply some kind of greater sense of belonging than peaceful coexistence. I think that phrase struck me because what it made me think was it was, first of all, a phrase very much I would associate practically, contingently with urbanization. It's very much what happens to people when they're thrown together. Yeah. You told the example of coming out at Penn Station. You live in this small space with a huge number of people. You have to be able to negotiate the spaces, but you precisely negotiate them by not having much of an emotional relationship, by having a more atomized relationship. So I think the issue is how to get something that's a little bit more affective than coexistence.
Well, since that was addressed to me, I'll answer and then I'll shut up. But I think it's good that we're mixing it up a little bit, because then I'd like to turn it around and put a question to you, if that's okay. As I said and will repeat, I believe that sustained, and I'll use the phrase again, peaceful coexistence is a very substantial human achievement that is all too rare in human history. I draw on one strand of the history of liberalism in making this point, and everybody knows what I'm about to say. The war between Catholicism and Protestantism that devastated Europe. I think an important part of the history of liberalism is the adoption of a strategy of peaceful coexistence with principles surrounding that strategy in order to bring that brutal, bloody, deadly warfare to an end. And so liberalism begins with a kind of principled peace treaty. And much of the idea of the retreat of the state from certain issues has to do with an analysis of what is necessary in order to make that treaty of peace possible. And and if one religion in a polity claims the right to dictate rights and practices to all other religions, then civil war and bloodshed, history suggests, is not far away. And so is peaceful coexistence a comprehensive moral theory? No. But without it, the rest of morality has no play.
Yeah, I completely, I don't disagree with any of that. I think all of what I'm trying to say is, in a sense, going back to what Patrick was talking about, the sort of different forms of, he was talking about economic liberalism and progressive liberalism, but going back to this morning's discussion as well, it seems to me that liberalism can only overcome its original blindnesses to gender, race, and possibly to speciesism in the long run. Who knows? We don't need to discuss that right now. Its blinders on various subjects without the kind of addition of something more effective. So for me, it's what you're talking about is great for guaranteeing liberty. But if we want to talk about equality or social justice, then I think there has to be, that's where you have to have some kind of way of relating to other people that isn't just that you're willing to be with them in the same space, although I completely grant that that is superior to killing everybody. This I completely grant. And that's why I emphasize the oppositional character of liberalism, which was to say we can't use these old rules or, we will have bloodshed forever. We need new rules. But it's very difficult to get the new rules to bend in important new ways unless there's this affective element added to it, which to me is extremely important because equality has to be imaginable or it doesn't work. And I think so for me it's, okay, I've said it.
I'd love to add a little historical dimension to that, to a historian, I know you know. Madame de Staël, this wonderful woman, great intellect of the early 19th century, one of the founders of liberalism, I would say, living right after the cataclysm of the French Revolution, when the Catholic Church had been at a point where it was devastated, and morals seemed to be crumbling. There was tremendous amount of selfishness. Bonds had been broken. The poor were dying in the streets and so on and so forth. She needed to find, they were worried, these early liberals, what do we replace it with? What do we replace Christian morals with? It has been some kind of binding ethos. And so she was grappling with this, I think, in her novels. And she was proposing things that may seem a little, nebulous or not precise enough, but she was, I think, proposing generosity and compassion, and she was advocating it, struggling to find something. And I think she understood that it is also about emotion. And I think actually she thought women were carriers of this, of morals, and that this was a really important job for women to do, mothers, wives, was to cultivate the moral virtues within the family. So to say also that liberalism completely left out women is not correct. They had a certain view of what the woman's role should be, but it was very much about also creating the kind of citizens that could support a liberal political system.
If I may, let me introduce just a slightly different kind of notion of the common good that I think is compatible with some strands of liberalism. And that is a notion of the common good which allows for the possibility, call it if you like, the radical possibility of individual self-creation, which I think for many of us at least, particularly for many of us in the arts who came of age in the era of high modernism, was a primary value. And which I think is no longer regarded as such in many precincts of the culture. I'll just read you one sentence from Richard Rorty, which I think is interesting. He wrote, "Some people who want to live originally and imaginatively find the means of doing so by turning away from responsibilities to others." Unquote. And that's a kind of, for me at least, a striking and in some ways challenging and disturbing formulation. And yet I think in many ways we know what it means, and there are ways of reading it which are, at least after a while, not so very disturbing. And I want to suggest that in my own conception of the common good, when we talk about individualism, we want to be talking about that possibility as at least open to some of us. Anyway.
Turning away from others, we should think about
Yeah,
as part of the common good.
Yes.
Well, then we're,
turning away from.
if I may, then we're doing really well at this. Helena said that who could disagree with Bill? I'll disagree with Bill. I don't disagree either with the ideals of consent or peaceful coexistence, but I guess what I disagree with is when these become in some ways instantiated as the first principles of politics. Or let me step back from that. When they become the first principles of all aspects of life, in a sense. How can one, in a sense, conceive of oneself or be a consenting individual unless one in some ways forefronts the choosing self as the essence of what I am? And you talked about the person that's born and in such a condition, that person, that entails certain kinds of obligations. It entails obligations perhaps on the part of the child. It entails obligations on the part of the parent and the parents. But in a society that forefronts consent, it's also the case that the kinds of things or the ways in which one is raised or one raises a child is not going to simply be, or I think it will be a rare thing, I think, to raise a child with indifference to the choices that the child makes. With indifference that you are going to become a consenting individual, and I'm going to raise you so that you are, in some senses, as fully as possible liberated from any preference, any kind of guidance on the kind of life that you might want to lead. I think every parent comes to the parenting role with certain hopes and certain kinds of aspirations for the kind of person that will be, and is not indifferent to the kind of human that will come to the point of being able to consent. In other words, consent won't take place in the absence of or with the elimination of a whole set of kind of inheritances, whatever those might be. Those might be religious, those might be a certain set of values, those might be secular, they might be in many different things. But one of the things that when you forefront this idea of the self-making self is that what it seems to me to do is on the other side, it requires a minimization of commitment. That consent, okay, can I finish or?
No, I was I was not trying to interrupt you, but thoughts were flashing through my head.
All right.
That's all. I was getting excited.
Good. That in some ways that the ideal of this consent, this self-making self, is the self that always has to be able to make oneself over and over and over again, at least in potentia. And so one of the consequences of such a vision of the self is the self-making self, who then in some ways has to minimize the commitments that one makes. And if we look at this kind of, I think if we look at the kind of society that we see today, and there are lots of ways we can measure this, but a lot of social science measures of this show us that we're a society really good at, let's say, potentially making commitments, but getting ourselves out of those commitments. That we're a society that's really good at the self-making self in some ways, that minimizes our commitment. We're increasingly a society of these individuals, of these aspirational figures that existed in theory in the state of nature, but now have come increasingly to exist in the society that we've made. And so all of these kinds of Putnam findings, the decline of people who will be members in various kinds of civic associations, what I think was in many ways the backbone of a society that I think many of us would like to see, a society that conceives of ourselves as citizens engaged in a common project, a society that keeps its family obligations, that's far less likely to break families apart than it is to exit families, a society in which, whether you're religious or not, that you can raise your child with a certain expectation that they are likely to remain in your religious tradition, and that maybe that's a matter that should be a matter of indifference, but for religious believers it's not a matter of indifference. And you don't want it to be a coin flip whether your children remain in your religious tradition or not, but it is today. In most religious traditions, it's a matter of a coin flip, 50%, whether your child remains in your religion or not. And even whether we have children, of course, is itself, it seems to me, one of the major challenges of the modern West, in which child reproduction rates are plummeting in both Europe and the United States. So it seems to me that you're right, consent is what's forefronted in a liberal society. But such a society can expect, and I think you said it's not acidic, but can expect, and indeed ought not to be surprised, to see a society increasingly of individuals who've lost any conception or ability to see what constitutes the common good.
I think that was addressed to me.
It might have been. Anyway. Empathy.
And let me say why I disagree with that as a
I thought you might.
a general proposition. And let me just be personal for a minute. About 10 days ago, my wife and I celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary. Okay? We chose to get married. There was no matchmaker, there was nobody telling us to get married. There were some people telling us not to, but that's a different story. And when I said that there is a morality of choice, one of the things that I had in mind is choices have consequences. And to choose is to take ownership of those consequences, to take responsibility for them. There are choices that have consequences that you can't undo, right? I mean, this is sort of Heraclitan sociology, right? You can't step in the same river twice. And it is an abuse of choice to believe that your choices don't have consequences for which you're responsible. And that is individualism as I understand it. And if your choices have consequences not just for those close to you, but for those more distant from you, you have to take responsibility for that as well. And so I resist the proposition that if you choose to get into a marriage, for example, that implies that you can blithely exit that marriage. That's not the way it works. It may surprise you.
This is the way it works.
Well, actually, the rate of divorce in this country is down more than 60% from where it was in the year 1980. That's quantitative sociology, not qualitative sociology, and not only that, the rate.
What was that rate?
On the annual basis of 20 per 1,000, and it's now down to about 8 per 1,000, if memory serves. But and not only that, the stratum that had the most quote unquote progressive values turns out to be the piece of society that is closest to maintaining the traditional conception of marriage. So there's some loose jointedness in this analysis, I believe, and there's another question. What is the alternative?
Right.
Is the alternative to tell people that once they get married, they can never get divorced? I don't think so. Is the alternative to assign people to professions? Is the alternative to tell young adults that because they were raised Catholic or Protestant or Jewish or Hindu, they have no choice to remain in that religion? Practically speaking, what's the alternative? Is it a community that forces people to stay in the moral community defined by their parents? Is that the recommendation?
So can I get in on this too? Yeah. So that's an example of what I mean about why liberalism is so much more effective as an oppositional strategy, because it is much easier to say, I completely agree with you that we would be opposed to that, but I think I would like to defend Patrick a bit on this point, because I think the fact is choice has become a problem, and I don't just mean a moral problem. It's related to the economic liberalism problem, because choice is very much caught up in a consumer economy in which changing your car as often as possible is really good for some people, especially people who manufacture cars and make profits off of them. And it's clear that the whole issue of having endless choices, I mean, you you can't even decide which brand of iPhone you want, or smartphone you want to get. You have to decide whether the 8, the 10, or the 10X, or the 10S, or the whatever is what you need. Well, this is taking up a massive amount of people's mental energy, trying to decide their cars, their shoes, their houses, what's in their house. The choice question is not just a moral question, is what I'm saying. It is caught up with the kind of economy that we live in, and it has posed certain kinds of problems. I mean, when I went to college, I chose between 4 places, one down the street, one across the river, one 35 miles away, and one somewhere else, I can't remember. Maybe it was a few more 100 miles away. Now, poor 18-year-olds, it's just like a nightmare. They can choose from anything in the world. Not that they're all equally realistic, but it was a lot easier, frankly, to have fewer choices.
And mates, too. I mean, a world with Tinder.
So,
Boy, talk about models of cars.
So I think it would be wrong to say that there isn't an issue. I mean, I agree with you completely that I don't want to go back to the world in which all those choices were made for us. God knows, speaking as a woman in our time, this is absolutely true. But there is an issue about the kind of society we now live in and how to negotiate these issues. And I'm afraid that just talking about morals is not necessarily the way out of this, because I think, again, it has to do with our practices. So, you know, Charles Mills had a throwaway line this morning that was very important to me about West Indian novelists and the fact that in Britain now it's widely recognized that the contribution of the sort of former colonies to the literary life of Britain is now incredible. As also in this country, the contribution of people from what were seen as minority communities to our literary life is now incredible. To me, it's more something that has to be worked out by the culture, not by moral prescriptions that we might come up with. The question is, to go back to Ed's very important point, it depends on us to make choices that push things in the right direction. And how we can do that is still, I have to confess, unknown to me.
But the question with the liberals that I have studied, 19th century and 20th century, were not, when they spoke to about morals, and it was always associated also with religion, but also about education in general, right? And many of them spoke about public education. I mean, Adam Smith speaks about public education, right? And they spoke often about the necessity of liberal arts as actually something that made for good citizens. And that's worrying, too, about liberal arts in this. I know Ed Luce was making some jokes about it, but he seemed like a pretty educated guy to me. And, you know, public education, you've written about history, the deplorable state of people's understanding of history in this age is a very sad thing. And here we are in a public university. I mean, can we talk a little bit about public education and the role it plays in the making of citizens?
Or not. Let me just say, as a blanket matter, you know, that in this discussion so far, I've pursued one strand, but only one strand. I absolutely agree with you, Patrick, everybody, you know, that there's a canon of settings in which the moral formation of liberal citizens occurs. And those settings can function well or badly. I think we've made bad choices with public education. I think we've made other bad choices. For example, I am in principle opposed to the all-volunteer armed services. You know, I believe that everybody ought to be exposed to the responsibility of the common defense. I would be happier with a system now where you either did military service or civilian service for an equivalent length of time, you know, AmeriCorps taken to scale or something of that sort. But, you know, so if the if the argument is that we've given insufficient attention, number one, to the formative institutions, and number two, to the unchosen responsibilities and duties of citizenship in a liberal society, that's absolutely right. And I haven't put that in the foreground so far only because the assigned topic of individualism, it seemed to me, was the entering wedge for the conversation.
We have a little time for questions if anyone would like to ask. You want to step to a microphone, please?
Greetings. I know a number of you, 3 out of 5. Anyways, I happened to teach Locke this morning, the second treatise. Locke was all in favor of God, all in favor of the family, all in favor of individual rights, all in favor of toleration, all in favor of a plurality of churches. And then there's Mill, he's later in the semester, and he was all in favor of individuality in addition to liberalism, and all of them were certainly in favor of the public good. So these are archetypical liberals, I would think, although Helena might disagree. And I haven't heard anything today that differs from anything that any of them have said. What is different, clearly, is the historical context. And I don't think there's been enough said about that, and I would like you to say a little bit more about it. Locke did not face capitalism. Mill was dealing with an empire of a sort that we are not. We're a different kind of empire. And you also haven't discussed, in some ways, the way in which liberalism, if it's going to be persuasive and respectful of individuals, can't just hector them with saying, oh, it is for the common good, or it does have this character, or it doesn't have that character. And I wondered whether or not, well, first of all, exactly what you think is the distinctive climate of liberalism. Let's forget about for a moment what Edward Luce tries to situate us in terms of history, because, I mean, what happens if Kavanaugh withdraws, right? What if the 2018 elections, right, go radically different than our current makeup? But if you could just say a little bit more about what distinguishes us from the early adherents of liberalism, whether or not they're pre-Helena or post-Helena, and secondly,
Never post.
and secondly, whether or not
Plan to stick around for a while.
and specifically how you address questions of politics and power that may not, if they don't stem from an ideological root in some understanding of liberalism. So 2 questions about historical context and power.
Well, I just very, very briefly to the question of the climate of liberalism. One element in the tradition of liberalism is associated with expressions like sweetness and light, and that tradition associated with, of course, going all the way back to the mid-19th century and Matthew Arnold and Culture and Anarchy, and then 100 years ahead to Lionel Trilling's The Liberal Imagination, hardly seems to me to be a description of the tenor of contemporary liberalism as I experience it and witness it in the university nowadays. There's a kind of equability and spirit of, again, of tolerance that hardly seems to me to be very much in evidence as again, as I observe the university. So that's at least one sort of strand of liberalism as one thinks about that expression, the climate. Right here, the climate seems very much to be of a piece with that. Elsewhere, I don't think so.
The climate is like this because everyone thinks the same. I mean,
Sorry?
Well, you're talking about the peaceful climate of the universities, and the reason that they're peaceful and full of toleration is because they're largely of the same view today. Universities, as I was saying, the kinds of formative cultural institutions, I think this really goes to the question of education today, have become very monolithic and univocal in lots of ways. And universities, I think, are particularly in this problem right now. But and I think this in some ways speaks to the problem of power. And it seems to me that one of the things that brings together my interlocutors today and my interlocutors next week, my liberal friends and my conservative liberal friends, is at some level, liberalism is about a kind of defense of a certain kind of inequality.
Inequality?
Inequality. That that particularly, and of course it's evident to us the way in which this is manifest in the economic realm. Next week I'll be, with Jonah Goldberg, et cetera. And this really draws on John Locke. Locke's argument in Book 5 of the Second Treatise of Government on Property is about, in some ways, differentiating those whom he calls industrious and rational from those who are querulous and contentious, or what Rush Limbaugh would call Republicans and Democrats, right? That the economy envisioned is one in which those who are going to be productive and industrious have every right to the fruits of their labor. And this is, of course, why Madison argues that the first object of government is the protection of the diversity and the faculties of men from which arise the rights of property. In other words, the differentiation of the ability to accumulate property is the first object of government in the classical liberal tradition. But I would submit that today, in the context particularly of the cultural institutions, that the cultural institutions in many ways are Millian. And they're Millian in particular in defending and building a space for in particular, the emergence of the individual, as was previously described, the creative individual. The creative individual, in particular, who needs to be liberated from the tyranny of custom and the tyranny of tradition. And the educational institutions, which were in some senses, I think in the liberal arts tradition, were in many ways about, at least in part, the conveyance of tradition and the conveyance of a kind of knowledge that was won in the past, have now become the most hostile. The institutions, in some ways, most hostile to the idea of a transmission of a tradition, and the most iconoclastic institutions. And if you're a defender of the old tradition, you have no place in the modern university because you're seen as this person is antithetical to the contemporary mission of the university. But this, in a way, I think, actually defends a different kind of inequality, which is the inequality, the advantages that particularly accrue to the people who are very good at being self-making selves, which actually corresponds quite well to those who do well in our capitalist economy, it turns out. And why the people who are most likely to attend, and to succeed in institutions that are based on this, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, so forth, are also going to be the winners in our economic system today. So I actually think that both sides of liberalism, both faces of liberalism in this sense, are about power, about creating a system that benefits a certain kind of person, and they're actually coming largely together in the economic and the cultural realm, even though we've been fighting over this for the last 50 years.
Well, John, I'm sorry.
I was just to, to disagree with you a little bit, or to push back a little bit on the liberal arts education. I mean, would you be against, I think of it as a way of teaching students to be critical thinkers, to engage with traditions. I mean, certainly when I teach Locke, and I think I was talking about that. We're not. It's not a question of hero worship, or it's a question of kind of learning to think. And surely we don't want to have students and citizens just accepting traditions, but to question them.
I agree with that entirely. I guess, I came of intellectual age during a kind of a radical time, particularly in the English departments and so forth, where it wasn't so much critical thinking, it seems to me, that was the object. It was to criticize the authors that we were looking at. In other words, to bring to bear our own superior understanding to the texts, to the past. And that's a different matter. I think there's a critical engagement. I think every tradition as Alistair McIntyre, my colleague. Every tradition is, in some ways, a kind of constant, ongoing,
Right.
critical self-examination. And at its best, that's what the liberal arts is. But it's also the capacity to recognize our own shortcomings in our own time.
course.
Right. And there's where I think a kind of, the idea of the arc of history can blind us. And I really appreciated Ed Luce's talk today because it's this kind of, this assumption of a kind of, that we can see better because we're higher on the arc of history.
And a kind of
That's really problematic.
condescension or, yeah.
I think we've reached a point of agreement, but
Talking to each other?
but I'd now,
Oh,
I'd like to say something in precise response. I think that was John Wallach asking the question. Oh, yes, the lights are blinding, but I thought I recognized your voice. Our current moment is defined by a revolt against liberalism. And for those of us who believe that the revolt against liberalism can only lead to outcomes worse than liberalism, with all the flaws of liberalism, this is a moment that calls for as full-throated a defense, not of liberal practices or policies, but of the basic principles of a liberal order, as full-throated a defense as one can muster. Why is this revolt occurring? Here, I think, Patrick and I might find a lot of common ground. I know, Ed Luce said a lot of things today with which I agree. If one of the promises of liberalism is real substantive equality of opportunity, it's hard to deny the fact that not only have we not achieved that, but we've fallen away from it in the past generation. I do not believe that liberalism is necessarily at its best or finest or most potent as an oppositional strategy. William Beveridge was a liberal. Franklin Roosevelt was a liberal. And those were not critical enterprises. Those were creative and constructive enterprises that built orders that we're still dining off 60 years later, 70 years later. So to the extent that liberalism understands itself as oppositional, it will fail in its principal task, which is to come up with constructive, practical solutions to the disorders of our current common life.
Okay, one more question here. Yes, thank you.
Hi, I'm Anne. I'll leave it at that. I want to query this. Well, let me first just say I'm all for choice and consent, which is a form of choice. But I think we're valorizing it to the point where we're, and I'm saying we, but you, ignoring the fact that many people, most people in the world don't have many choices. Many people have practically none. So we're so worried about all of these choices, and of course consumer capitalism has that problem to it, but not for most people. I mean, okay, maybe cereal, but even so. Not cars, not iPhones. We're at CUNY, not Harvard, not Notre Dame, and but we could go beyond this. Our students don't have as many choices as we might like to think, as you might like to think. The students here, anyway, and I don't necessarily mean at the Graduate Center. That's different, but in the provinces, and I see this every day, and I think a problem with liberal arts education perhaps might be more how cloistered we are than a hegemonic ideology or something that is putatively governing us. And I would add one more kind of non-choice that's huge and that I personally experience, which is biological, that is genetic mutations or other physical limitations that people, or mental for that matter, might be born with. So I think there's some fantastical quality in a way to this, and to the conversation, and a utopianism about choice and consent, and it's an aspiration perhaps to increase these realms in certain areas, but I would just ask that you think about and maybe talk to for a moment how much necessity, which I would call the opposite of choice, there is also governing most people in the world. Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you so much for being here. Thanks to our panel.
I'd be interested to find out. Next, got what you wanted. I'm sure it'll be tougher than this one.